All right, I've got 1 p.m. Eastern, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our Civilian Services Acquisition Workshop, or CSAW webinar. Today's topic is Performance Standards and the QASP with Acquisition Project Management Specialist and CSAW Facilitator Eugene Wong. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, please note that today's meeting is being recorded and you may opt out of the call at any time. Today's presentation will be emailed out to everyone on today's call and it will also be available for direct download in the chat box. But if you have trouble accessing it via email or via chat, please email us at pshcevents@gsa.gov and we'll send over a copy. I will drop that email address in the chat area shortly, so there's no need to write that down. Your mics are muted and the chat area will be disabled or is disabled, so please feel free to use the Q&A pod at the bottom of the screen to ask any questions regarding today's topic. We will try our best to address them throughout the presentation, but we also have a Q&A portion of today's presentation towards the end. We are capturing attendance on our end through the Zoom system, so CLPs will automatically be sent out to everyone on the call, and there's nothing that you need to do on your end. If you don't receive a certificate within 2 to 4 weeks, please email us at that same email address I mentioned earlier, pshcevents@gsa.gov. Finally, a post-event survey will be sent out to everyone on today's call. We kindly ask that you take a few minutes to complete that. It would really help us improve your CSAW webinar experience in the future. And with that, it is a pleasure to hand it over to you, Eugene.
Thank you, Carl. Appreciate it for the introduction. Good afternoon. My name is Eugene Huang. I am a CSAW facilitator. I've been in the acquisition force since the 2010 on the assisted acquisition services with the GSA. I started my career as a CS 1102 and currently moved over to 1101 Project Management Series. And I am here today to talk more about the performance standard and QASP. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for being here. So let's get started. As we go forward, please use the Q&A pod and put any questions that you have. I will take a pause, and if we have questions, try to answer that as we move through the slide. So before we go dive into QASP and performance standard, we need to cover a little bit about performance-based acquisition, because the performance standard and QASP is a key element of a performance-based acquisition. And performance-based acquisition is defined by FAR, which definition, it says performance-based acquisition means an acquisition structured around the results to be achieved as opposed to the manner by which the work is to be performed. It meaning that it's focusing on result and outcome, not necessarily how one will do the job, which creates more innovation and effectiveness as it progresses. And because oftentimes when you're using prescriptive language, you are setting yourself in a boundary, which can cause frustration and end up maybe costing us a little more. The key element of a PBA is really focusing on the out result, not who's performing it, how they're doing it, but do they meet the end result that government is looking for. With that said, the performance-based acquisition is a preferred method of acquiring services. I'll tell a little more details on that. And agency must use the PBA method to maximum extent practicable. And it is stated on the FAR, and I'll give you some FAR definitions and points as we move forward. So regarding the performance-based acquisition, since the 1980s, government actually had the term performance-based contracting, which is called PBC, and performance-based service contracting, which switched over in 1990s as a performance-based acquisition and performance-based service acquisition, because they did a study in the 90s regarding PBA acquisition and see how it'll efficiently move the government to the future of acquisition. And there was about 18% increase in satisfaction in performance and about 15% reduction in overall cost. And they only did about 26 acquisition at the time for the study. But what happened is during the 90s, post those study, the Government Performance and Result Act, which was 1993, and Federal Acquisition Streaming Act of 1994, and Klinger-Cohen Act of 1996 really pushed for the performance-based acquisition because there were a lot of changes and development of ITs and new technology being coming. It is hard for government to define this is how you should do the work when there's a lot of innovation continuously happening every day. So the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, General Accounting Office, GAO, and Office of Management and Budget pushed forward extending, ensure that most service acquisitions should use PBA moving forward. And it really focuses on the method, the maximum extent practicable, because when you're acquiring services, especially in the PBA service, it really creates that room for vendors to grow and provide the efficient method to let government or let us know, hey, I understand you want to reach this end result. Have you thought about doing it this way? Or, hey, we know there's this new technology coming up. We can probably reduce some of the time involved in getting to the result. Whereas if you're using the CSAW and you're providing, hey, you should tie the knot this way, you should provide X, Y, Z. Well, that ties the vendor to the process itself, not the end result and outcome. So it really creates a lot of innovation and competition as well. And lastly, July 2003, OFPP issued a report, Performance-Based Service and Contracting for Future, because there was a lot of reduction in cost and increase in performance that was able to rate. And we'll talk more as we go on, other than compliance, the performance-based acquisition, the key elements of it, and performance standard diving into deeper, and quality assurance and quality surveillance plan. So what makes the performance-based acquisition? So there are 4 key elements. And for you people who like the FAR section, it is FAR 36.601. It states that performance-based contract for services shall include a performance work statement, PWS, or may deliver from SUE, because vendor will then provide PWS based on your scope of objective. 2, measurable performance standard in terms of quality, timeliness, quantity, and so forth that you can measure, and a method of assessing the contractor performance against performance standard. Key element, which we'll discuss here. Performance incentives where appropriate. It doesn't mean that you have to give them incentives all the time, and we'll talk a little bit about positive and negative incentives. But when used, performance incentives shall correspond to the performance standard. Again, we will discuss a little further. And 4th, in the contract. Again, that describes a little more in incentives than performance standard in FAR 16.42-2. And all performance-based acquisition must have a QASP. It must have a quality assurance and surveillance plan. Now, it doesn't include the award fee type contract and task orders. We'll discuss a little bit down the road. So it is crucial for performance-based acquisition to have these 4 key elements. And if you're having these 4 key elements, that means you have performance-based acquisition. Now, if I asked you, hey, do you have a PWS? Do you have a quality indicator? Oftentimes, I myself included, 90% of the time, we'll use timeliness, such as, hey, you need to provide this report within 5 days of the month, or after receiving this service order call, you shall provide call center follow-up or certification ready or not. So it is very important to have performance standard, not just the timeliness, but always tie into the quality standards as well. So let's talk about performance standard. So FAR 37.603, 603, again, my apologies, 37.603, performance standard. It says that performance standard establish the performance level required by government to meet contract requirement. It just means the standard shall be measurable and structured so they can succeed. You don't want to set a performance standard that vendor cannot achieve, because that's pointless. of having performance standard. It is also to allow us to have that assessment and clear understanding to the contractor. I see the question came up from Craig, who is responsible to write the QASP? Now, that can be really depending on your requirement, but generally QASP is owned by the government, but it is also can written by the vendor as well, especially if you're providing a performance requirement standard and AQ, which we'll address a little further down when we're talking about QASP. So another thing on a performance standard is when offer proposed performance standard in response to sue, agency shall evaluate proposal standard to determine whether it meets agency need. Meaning that if you are asking vendor to come up with a performance standard, which will tie it into their quality control, we need to make sure that the performance standard they provided meets and identifies that performance we are asking them to come up with the standard. Meaning that if the vendor comes up and say, yeah, we will put as a timeliness. Okay, timeliness, which a lot of times we use on QASP. They will say, we will, within 24 hours of receiving phone call, we will complete the onboarding of a new employee. Sounds great, right? Well, but what if the onboarding does happen within 24 hours, but they make so many errors that new employee try to log on, password is incorrect. They are assigned to different groups, subgroups that don't have access to certain network drives. Well, what if then? Because on the QASP, on the proposed performance standard, they said the timeliness, and we government agreed, yeah, timeliness sounds great because we need them to work expediently right after. So you agree to that timeliness 24-hour standard, but now you are finding out all these errors within their incorrect account setup, some of those issues that you may not foreseen it. So it is very crucial to utilize your time if it makes sense. However, tie those to the certain qualities that you can associate as well. So it is, again, important for us to come up with those performance standard, but if you're asking vendors to come up, make sure they make sense for your contract. All right, so let's talk about performance standard in some of these examples. So we already discussed some of timeliness, response time, delivery time, whether they are providing meeting agenda, meeting note after you have the meeting, they are coming up with a development plan, project management plan, they need to do after certain days after kickoff, all the timeliness. Great. Another one is quality, error, accuracy rate, and expectation of a quality product. You know, they are working as intended. Quality can be very subjective, and we'll dive in a little deeper when we are talking about quality assurance and coming up with a better standard. And also another is the progress, or the milestone completed, such as they were able to deliver 50% functionality website or a hub that can gather all the information to all the share drive is working. There is also cost control portion, performing within estimated cost. Now, the cost fee, it's really not in the performance standard. We'll dive a little deeper in there. Cost control really comes to when you have a set budget of your project, not a cost plus fee or cost plus award type, but when you have a set budget and you're trying to control that budget, then that can be used as a performance standard. But we'll dive deeper as we talk about service level agreements on next slide. So these are the examples of performance standard, and obviously these are some general ones, but always think about uniqueness to your requirement and combine the timeliness and quality together. It is never bad an idea to combine those performance standard for your requirement. The reason being is here in next slide, we'll talk about service level agreement. Reason being is when you have just one tier performance standard, you are going to miss some other essentials. Like I gave you example earlier, that if you are using onboarding as an example in call center, yeah, they are meeting within 24-hour response time. They gave the account information. Great, right? Now they are going to get on their CPARs excellent rating because they always met or exceed those time performance standard that you provided. However, you're not meeting the quality indication, right? If they are onboarding on people, now you're spending 4 days, 5 days extra admin time to get these people, new employees on board because it wasn't set up incorrectly in the beginning. Now, whose fault is that? Well, we know that vendor didn't quite do their job, but we said the quality indicator, the performance standard is timeliness. Now, that's going to be additional cost the government will have to provide. So with that said, I want to touch base on the service level agreement a little bit here because it does work on particular thing as a call center. So the difference between service level agreement and performance standard here on this slide. It is very broad and big for the service level agreement. And these works well with like a call center setting, some of IT, because they're looking for availability, responsibility that is broad term, meaning, let's say, when you pick up the phone, you anticipate 99.9%, if not 100% of the time, you expect the phone to work. That will be service level agreement. Can that be a performance standard? Can you use it? Sure. But service level agreement is a 5-7 broad objective of performance that you can apply to overall objective of some contract. So like a call center, IT support, like such a thing as we expect 99.9% uptime of server. We want dedicated hosting server. I would like to have a relay service that is always on time, or toll-free number. When somebody uses that toll-free number, it is to be acted as a toll-free number 99% of the time. So you can use that service a big level of agreement and covers broad whole range of requirement because having toll-free number or having 99% server uptime, that could be their backup server, their call center, that is a very broad that covers wide range of requirement, whereas performance standard really goes down to your requirement, performance level required by that particular contract that you're working on. And then which should be measurable and structured to prevent, again, to ensure there is a success that you can identify. And the required level of performance standard goes in deeper, like into the quality and the progresses. It's a specific requirement or task. So it is night and day difference there. And it is best interest, again, going with the performance-based acquisition, go with the performance standard, and that will allow you to come up with a better quality assurance surveillance plan as well. So that is a huge difference there. But with that said, I'll give you another example of a call center service level agreement. A telecom company service level agreement, for example, they promise network availability 99% of time, meaning that you pick up the phone, it's working. That is broad because, yeah, you can be voice over IP phone, you can be cell phone, it can be landline phone. So it's covering the broad requirement. Whereas a performance standard, if you're going a little down deeper to your requirement, it's going to cover, for the GSA, for example, we use Verizon, and Verizon, you should have X amount of time that can be shared between all the calls. And that now has your specific need, and your specific need should have a performance standard, how you're going to measure it, instead of a broad, ambiguous objective that can be hard to enforce. Just like the example earlier, if you're only relying on the timeliness of it, the quality portion goes out. Another example will be like a restaurant. You go into a restaurant, you anticipate them to provide you with the water and a menu. The general idea is that you order food, you want the food to come out edible, right? Not cold, not watery, but then your requirement may need specific need, like instead of a chicken, you want steak. Instead of steak, you want fish. Well, fish need to be cooked different than from steak. Steak have to be medium well, or the chicken doesn't need to be dry. So that now becomes performance standard, not subject level agreement. You have a specific need that's going to meet your requirements and create success. And also from here, we need to touch a little base on the personal services. Oftentimes, depending on your requirement too, but oftentimes you have a certain vendor that comes to your location or your site, whether it's O&M services or your lawn mowing or chemist who's providing analysis services, whatnot. And what happened is when you don't have a clear standard, what you are measuring. Linda, I saw your QASP, and I will touch that base a little bit here as we go into the process, onto the slide. So again, going back to the personal services, first of all, you need a specific authority, but when you're measuring the standard, the performance itself, it's often easier for us to say, you know, Jack and Jill does a great job. They do what we ask them to do. Things are spotless. They always outperform. But the problem is, as a performance acquisition, you are measuring the outcome, not the person, not the company, not the way it has been done, because you need to be able to reproduce that outcome. So it's, again, personal services is prohibited unless you have a specific authority. And it is important why to have a performance standard and very thoughtful on your specific requirement, because that will take away, well, Jack does this way or Jill does great job this way. Well, if you have a good performance standard, what you're measuring, and you are letting the vendor know this is how we are going to measure your success, and that should be able to repeatable. Along with that, I will strongly recommend whatever contract you're working on, use that as your library. You might not have a great PWS right now, but you see some of the pain point you dealt with because the performance was not meeting, because when either failed to notice that during the acquisition planning portion and coming up with those performance standard, or throughout the maturity of the contract, you came up with some other innovation that vendor proposed, and then things are changing. So you want to start building those library, have those knowledge base for you. So again, we just covered quickly on the service level agreement and performance standard, why is it important, and how we can be forgetful about coming up with a good indicator, not just on timeliness, but also using quality as well. Well, that start with writing a better requirement. There is a great question, Nathaniel. Should the performance standard be listed on the QASP? You know, we'll talk about QASP here after 5-7 slides more. Go here. And I see another question. Great questions. I'm really liking it. So again, we talked about performance standard, why it is important to come up with a good performance standard, because you may miss something you want to combine. You don't want to have some vague performance standard. And it all start with writing better requirements. So here's an example of what we use in CSAW workshop as ARC model. It's called action, result, and context. And it really covers your requirement, but diving in deeper what you're trying to really approach. So right now, here you see a statement, original statement that says, contractor shall train system end users on how to use the system. That sounds about right. You want the contractor to train the user how to use the system. Okay, so when we are using the ARC model, action, result, and context, you're really diving into what your end result is via what context. So here we have each requirement starting with the contractor shall or must, and then we are adding the action verb train, and the context on how to use the system, particular system. And then on the result is we want end user to be able to use the system. Now, everything after position is a context. And the reason we're using this example is really to give you a better idea on revision, meaning that how you're coming up with your performance standard based on well-written performance requirements. So here's a revision. The contractor shall provide a training to end user on how to use the system. To contractor shall deliver a user manual for all aspects of system. Because now you could be just an acquisition shop. Client comes in, hey, I need to buy this training requirement and we want the end user to know how to use the system. Okay, well, but how you want to achieve that? You want them to have a user manual? You want them to have on-demand videos recording they can study on their own and take a quiz? And how you want to measure end user knowing you're using the system? How are you going to measure that? Are you going to have tests? Are you going to make sure they're pass fail, or they have to get a certificate? So depending on those specific need, you really need to dive deeper into the writing your requirement well. So here, contractor shall deliver on-demand training, so user can independently develop and deploy survey using service as software as a service. And there are already multi-layer of information on your requirement that you need to get your team, whether subject matter experts or it's me or your client itself, make sure dive deep into that requirement. Again, looking back from the original statement, the contractor shall train system end user on how to use the system. It makes sense. It does. But then when you are thinking about, okay, what is the performance standard? Rethinking about your performance requirement really helped you coming up with a better performance standard. Again, on this example, it could be manual, it could be video training, it could be test. Is there a certificate involved? Is there pass fail? So now those becomes your good performance standard per your particular need. From here, once you have a well-written performance work statement, you want to have performance standard for all, because again, we just went through writing good requirement, which will allow you to measure, engage, and develop the good performance standard. Now that when you are able to do this portion, this goodie we will be sharing with you after the workshop. This is something that we use in our CSAW workshop. It's called requirement roadmap. As you see from left to right, on the left, task statement, the PWS, you are using the ARC method to coming up with the specific requirement. So the first example states here, contractor shall provide training to end users on how to use the system. Okay, now the performance standard is training result in effective availability aspects of system. AQL, accepted quality indicator. Quality level, 90% of staff are used to able to effectively use the system setting. And the what source, now there is a whole list assessment, there's incentives, which we'll dive deeper here shortly in the class. But using this method, you want to have performance standard for each performance work statement, each task item that you want them to do. There should be a clear objective and how you're going to measure what the success is. And using this as requirement roadmap, it'll clearly assist you coming up with a standard that really meets your requirement, not just a vague statement, not something one covers at all, because your requirement is unique to that acquisition, unique to your workshop, unique to your requirement. So again, this ties back to building your library as well. Once you went through, hey, yeah, initially our contract just said provide a training, but then as we dived in deeper, some of the innovation came from the vendor. I mean, imagine that time when the computer initially started, everybody just had this big manuals, right? But then now we're using CSAW. There's online that training you can do, the testing, all those innovation rolls around, that becomes your part of a tool, and that becomes your knowledge that you can implement in future requirement, because now you've seen the innovation. But when you're in midst of your contract requirement and the vendor proposes new innovation, you need to be able to adopt and be able to update your performance standard. I see the questions coming up here. Let me go through the quality surveillance plan here. So because we can talk about quality surveillance. So quality assurance surveillance plan. It states on FAR 37.604. It talks about quality assurance surveillance plan. It basically goes into requirement of quality assurance surveillance plan, 46.4, but it really dives in deeper that you need to have a plan when you're doing performance-based acquisition that offers should either submit or you need to create the performance standard, because that will tell them what the acceptable, what the success of that requirement is. So before going to that, the whole format and tying back to the ARC model and the requirement roadmap, let's talk about the quality assurance a little bit more, not just the plan itself. So what is a quality assurance? I mean, we all know what the quality is. We all know how to assure, but I think oftentimes we forget why is it important for your requirement, or sometimes how we can overlook certain things. Again, tying back to writing good performance standard, performance work statement. So quality assurance is a program that systematically monitoring, evaluates various aspects, your own requirement, whether it's a project, service, or facility, ensure that standard is met. So some of the notable quality assurance failure, well known, the Challenger explosion, there was a failure of an O-ring, the very simple one small portion that just destroyed the whole program. And there was also Firestone recall. The quality assurance was not apparently done properly enough that 14.4 million tires were recalled because it will start separating in high heat. And also there's a Samsung Galaxy Note 7, which is years ago. Basically, they didn't do enough testing, quality assurance on their portion, and battery caused explosion or high heat on extensive use. And even right now, you heard about the Boeing trouble right now, the door falling off. That can be another failure in your quality assurance or coming up with a certain standard that may not address a certain quality. I can just only assume they were trying to push out that Boeing 737. I don't even know which 737 Max or that particular model that the door fell off from the Frontier airline. They might be really needing the quality of timeliness. Hey, we need to get this airplane out. We need to get a process this airplane from factory to the user. They started using it. Next thing you know, door fell out. They had a whole this fiasco, stock going down, all this trouble. Well, they might have met the timeliness of it. They were able to get the plane out to the hangar to the hands of the client. However, the quality person might have missed it. You know, they may fail to check, ensure that, hey, maybe all the bolts should be tightened. Again, it is important to add another layer to the timeliness. And of course, timeliness when it makes sense, that should stand alone. I'll have some example as we go down here. So quality assurance is important because that's going to ensure whether your contract, your requirement is going to be successful. And having that correct quality performance standard will allow the vendor to know what the success is, how they're going to meet the requirement is. So quality assurance plus quality control is quality management. I'm not going to read this. I'm sure you're more excited to talk about the quality assurance plan. But again, to understand what quality assurance plan component holds. So quality assurance portion is the government. We all have the ownership, making sure that we are checking the quality. We're making sure the performance standards met. And quality control is on the vendor side, on the contractor. If during the quality assurance, we identify some errors or some area that need to be improved, the vendor should have a quality control plan, QCP, how they're going to remedy, how they're going to fix it. And then that can tie into incentives, which we'll talk about here briefly. And the whole package of that is the quality management. So quality assurance prevents, quality control detects and reduces the errors. All right, so going deeper, now that we know what the quality assurance is, going deeper into quality assurance and surveillance plan. So the surveillance philosophy is really not just quality assurance, but there's whole different components of it. You need to have performance requirement summary that I think somebody asked here. Nathaniel, should the performance standard be listed in the QASP? Well, performance standard should be listed in QASP because how is the core, or sometimes not even core, that who are surveilling know what is acceptable, right? So yes, the performance standard should be listed on the QASP, but also on your PWS as well under the performance requirement summary, because they need to know what is the success, what is the acceptable AQL quality level. So PRS, quality control plan, again, what the vendor provides. So let me go back here. PLS, performance requirement summary, should be on your PWS. It should be on the solar station because you're telling the vendor contractor, hey, this is what looks like success is, and this is what we want, okay? And the QASP, quality assurance surveillance plan, is on government. We create the document. Sometimes vendor can help with it, but we own that. We own how we are going to measure it, how often we are going to measure it, and what the outcome of incentive or disincentive will be. And QCP, quality control plan, is vendor, the contractor. They should come up with the control plan if there is an error, if there is some let's say you had to get meeting agenda reported or communication plan developed. Okay, they met the timeliness of it, but if are a lot of errors, what are they going to do? What are you going to do? Are you going to fix it within 24 hours? Are you going to fix it within 3 days? Those are kind of items that vendors should own as quality control plan and how they are going to remedy it. Let's see here, some question. We're talking about construction design build. I'll touch that in the last because a lot of times construction, it's very tied on to SAW because there's a requirement, plan designing. It's really, you can use service acquisition, but it can be very challenging for the construction. Craig, the question, when is the initial CSAW due at the award, X months after award? So I think you're asking when is the initial CSAW due? You should be having the general idea of what CSAW looks like when you're issuing the solicitation, unless you're asking vendor to come up with their quality control plan so you can adapt to that. And I will go in a little more the timeliness of it. It is better to have your CSAW soon as obviously before issuing the solicitation because it'll tie into your standard performance. Again, going back to the roadmap and writing better requirement, you should have what the standard looks like. Your frequency and who's going to monitor can change, so that can be updated as the contract lives on. And I'm going to beat this to the horse here. The QASP is and should never be on your contract. CSAW should never be on the contract because anytime you change something or innovation comes up, do you want to change how you're going to monitor, who's going to monitor? So let's say you have a huge multi-billion-dollar contract. You may have a primary core, but you may have a SME, you may have additional people in that team who's evaluating the quality, right? Well, if you put those names, those people on the contract and somebody leaves, takes a different job, or new certification is needed, that means you got to do mod because CSAW is on the contract. You definitely do not want to have CSAW on the contract. You do want to have a PRS, the performance requirement summary, because it'll tell you more about what the standard is. But how you're going to measure it, who's going to measure it, when you're going to measure it, there should be outside of contract. So you can have that tool as an incentive as well, which we'll dive here in a little bit. So PRS, again, it outlines the standard for the acceptable criteria, acceptable quality level, surveillance documentation, and it should be documented in PWS because it's letting the vendor know, hey, per this performance work statement, this is the standard we're looking for, and this is what is acceptable. Okay, I do have a few examples here that is not shared on your slide, but make sure if you resonates with you, please take a screen capture of it. So again, Craig, answer to your question, initial CSAW should be concurrent with your solicitation. When you have issued the solicitation, you should have some rough draft from CSAW if not completed one. And again, that can be updated as it goes on. And you don't want to have initial CSAW X month afterward. Well, because, okay, let's say you 3 months, 6 months after the word, well, how are you measuring the performance then? Who's checking it, right? So here is an example. Just take a look here quickly. I will look at some of the questions, see what else I can answer. Yeah, Catherine, you're correct. Never had a CSAW contract. If there are any changes, yeah, you got to do a mod. You don't want to do the mod. That's an admin time. That's extra cost to the government. Definitely not. Will an example of PWS or SU be provided? Template. Well, it's going to be a little challenging. If you want to talk about particular requirement there you are working on, we can definitely provide some insight because with IT, there's agile development, there are certain delivery models that we can provide you. However, there is really no template because every acquisition is unique. There are some challenges with that particular acquisition. So there is not going to be a one size fits all. So unfortunately, there is not going to be a PWS or SU that going to be provided with a template. However, if you want to reach out And the end of slide will have contact information. If you can provide us with some of your examples of what you're seeking, we can definitely address that. All right, so here is the example of a PRS, which should be on the requirement. Now, I want to caution you, I have a few examples here, and I didn't include on your slide because, again, depending on your acquisition, depending on your requirement, some of these should change. So, for example, on this particular slide, it talks about staffing leading time. So you should always have a requirement that associated to your PWS statement or task item. And then it talks about standard criteria acceptance. So it's saying what is acceptable, right? What you're going to measure. So it says the contractor shall staff all positions within 75 days of becoming back in or contract modification, creating the position. Okay, that makes sense, right? Now, the AQL, acceptable quality level, is 90% measured annually. Now, here's the nuance. Method of surveillance. The PLS can have a method of surveillance if it makes sense, because the question may come up, what do you mean 90% measured annually? Is it beginning of year, end of year, middle of year? Like what is that 90% fills in? So it's telling, on this example, it's telling how the method of surveillance, how they're going to calculate that 90%. Says in PRX sampling measured by dividing total number of position on board in 75 days or less. So it's telling how we are going to calculate what 90% means. And it tells you each month measured annually, last day of each month measured annually. So it's letting vendor know, hey, 90% measured annually means this. And if you don't meet that, that means you are not meeting the AQL. You're not acceptable quality is not being met. You're failing the standard, the performance standard. So now here's an incentive or remedy. Now, incentive or, I want to caution you again, incentive or, because not all your performance requirements going to have incentive, especially when you have a firm fixed price contract or when your budget is set, there's no fee to be awarded, there's no incentive to provide it. I will dive a little deeper on the incentive, but the remedy, on this example, the incentive is positive contractor past performance. Now, on here, I will add to as well, on the C parts, there are the indicators, right? There are the I can't try to think out of my head. There's a policy, there's a quality, there's a schedule, there's management plan. It works really nicely if you tie that past performance. So when you're saying, hey, we're going to put this rating on your C part, which one of them? Are you going to talk about small business? Are you going to talk about quality? Are you going to talk about management? So when you tie to that, and when you're doing CPAR, at the end of the year or the exercise and option year, it really clearly indicate where you should be putting that quality rating into. So on this example, it says positive contractor past performance. I mean, it works well, but when you tie to your CPAR rating, it's going to really work well and clearly help you. Even let's say core goes away, so you have a new core who's filling in and coming up with a CPAR rating. Well, they made rave on, hey, this vendor did an excellent job. They always made 90%. Okay, well, should I put that in management? Should I put that on schedule? Like, where am I putting that at? So again, CPAR has here it comes. CPAR has quality management, schedule, cost control, small business subcontracting, regulatory compliance, and the others. So when you tie to that incentive, it works fantastically. All right. Here's another example. It's moving up top class. So again, performance objective, it tells you where it ties into the paragraph, the acceptable level, and method of assessment. Now, method of assessment only included if it makes sense. You don't have to have a method of assessment because that can be ammunition, that can be another tool for your incentive. So this one says periodic surveillance and verified customer complaint. So there's a survey, we'll go into type of method and inspections. And then here's a remedy. Before we had incentives, right? If you're able to tie into it, but here's a remedy. If you're not meeting the AQL, what are you going to do? How are you going to fix that? So here is re-performance within one workday. So under your PRS, you should always have PW section, task order section, the section you are indicating what the work statement is, and the acceptable level, the AQL, and the how you are going to whether incentivize or remedy, because the failure should always tie into how they're going to fix it, because that will give the vendor to come up with a QCP, right? If your remedy says 7 days, you got to do X, Y, Z, or submit the report, the QCP will then say, well, we intend to do within 3 days, or we intend to have two people who's able to review concurrently as it goes on, because then that can be your trade-off during the solicitation and selection, right? You can be like, hey, these guys have a better quality control plan, because if that is one of your indicator for the awardee, that already clearly states they understand what we are looking for, clearly understand our objective, and coming up with a better quality control plan. Here's another PRS example, the performance objective PWS paragraph, because it's telling them where you can find it, and performance standard, and acceptable quality level, and method of inspection if it makes sense. Now, I am asking you guys not to always include method of inspection on the PWS, which PRS is a part of it, because let's say vendor is failing. You said we'll do monthly random check. Great. But as contract progresses, vendors continue to fail. They continue to fail. Well, you know what? Maybe it's time to do unscheduled, or even 100% inspection. Well, because it's now on the PWS, because you already listed method of inspection or surveillance on the PWS, now you need to do a mod. Oh, now they're going to find out. Oh, they're going to do 100% inspection. We better get ourselves, all to get put together, get this thing going. So I will strongly advise reconsider putting method of surveillance or inspection on your PWS or the PRS. PRS should be on the contract, because it's telling them what is, again, acceptable quality level is. But leave out the inspection. If it makes sense, put it in there, but leave that out, because that's going to be your incentive, and that's going to be part of your QASP that can be changed at will of government, because it's government-owned document. So here's another one you may see open. I gave a lot of examples because it really depends on your own requirement. So deliverable, so that's a PWS. The deliverable is activity report, frequency, the format. So you may see this type of deliverable table actually on your solicitation and our document. Deliver to how many you need to deliver. So this one has a due date. This one, again, doesn't have how often you're going to monitor. I mean, it makes sense because it's a activity report they need to do within 10 days. So it makes sense to have those frequencies in there, right? All right, let me look at some questions here while you guys are digesting that. So what if the standards are not spelled out in current contract? Can we add that as modification now? Then QASP will be a living document that can be changed. Yeah, Catherine, yes, you can. Now, but I will be very cautious. Part of the reason is that if you didn't have a performance standard in there and you now put it in via mod, well, the vendor is going to say, well, we didn't account for that. We didn't have the manpower to do that. Now you want us to, you're going to check this. We need to have a QCP. Well, pay us. So yes, you can, but I will really strongly caution you to approaching that. And if the quality is a mess, you need to have them. Yeah, go for it. But just be cautious about what you are, the cost might be increasing. And the cost is not only on the vendor side. Who's going to monitor it? If you didn't have a performance standard, now you need to train somebody, whether it's a core or somebody who's going to surveil. Now you need to have that body. Now that's 2 hours or 5 hours a month. They need to surveil this, right? So that's going to incur the cost. So this is why it's very important, tying back to writing the requirement, performance requirement correctly, right? Making sure your IPT is involved, your SME is involved, your core is involved. They have that owner ensure to identify what the acceptable quality is when you're writing that performance work statement. Let's see here, another question. Can we ask for a QCP specific to the performance standard of a contract task order being awarded? Yeah, I will clearly indicate that in part of a solicitation. Or if you don't have a PRS, a lot of times when you have a PRS, the vendor provides a QCP. I mean, with the performance-based service acquisition, the vendor usually provide how they're going to remedy, how they're going to to the quality control. If it's afterward that it was language wasn't there, if you didn't ask for it, again, that can incur the cost, but I will strongly advise building in the QCP and PRS as a part of the solicitation. Ask them how they're going to manage do the quality control. Have the PRS in there so they can, based on your PRS, based on your acceptable quality level, its performance work statement, they can come up with the QCP. If you don't have a PRS, I seen the contract where it doesn't have a PRS table. It just says PWS, 4.2, 4.3, XYZ. And vendor do try to come up with some method of controlling their quality. But if you don't tell them, hey, 50 is acceptable, 50% is acceptable versus 90%, now the level of effort that puts it in there is a lot different. So I will strongly advise to add that in the beginning or at the time of solicitation writing performance work statement. All right, Hilda, thank you, thank you. I'll look at some of these questions, answers here. So let me go into this. This is something I really like sharing. So the difference between PRS and QASP. The difference, huge difference, is having the frequencies of surveillance. How often you're going to surveil and method of surveillance. I mean, it doesn't make, if it makes sense to have the method of surveillance, yeah, put it in there. If you're hiring professional services, you need to have this scientist doing certain chemical analysis, whatever, you need that every day. Or they're sending this envelope with the white powders in it. They need to analysis done completed within 2 hours. Yeah, have the method of surveillance in there because it makes sense for your acquisition. But I will really strongly advise have the method of surveillance and frequency of surveillance out and include that on the cost, because that's going to be an incentive and that's going to be a tool when their performance is failing. Performance-based acquisition, really, the element is having the performance standard and way to measure and enforce it. So if you are adding the method of surveillance, or you're telling them, if you have a clause in the contract, you're losing all that tool. You're losing your ammunition to enforce and incentivize and create the innovation. So let's say you are in late 90s, early 2000s, and you are having IT training contract out there. And because at the time internet wasn't fast enough, or even now we can download a movie on the phone. I mean, that's a new innovation that comes up, right? So if you hide yourself to particular performance worksman saying, hey, you need to provide a training, it need to be on site because the internet was crappy, they couldn't do virtually. If there was in the contract, well, now the innovation comes up, they can do the training on demand, on the phone, on their personal laptop. Now that, again, prohibits that innovation, right? And also, when the innovation comes in, if you have those methods and frequency of surveillance, how you're going to do it, when you're going to do it, when you need to change because the performance is failing, or you need adapt to the new innovation, now you need to do a mod. So again, this is crucial, really important to leave the cost out, but drive from the PRS. So have the PRS on the solicitation, on the requirement, telling them, we're going to look at this. We're going to tell you this is how you succeed or fail, and based on this information. So you're having those, again, incentive and remedy, or incentive or remedy. If the remedy should be something that QCP, the vendor, should always come up with. So here's a good example of the difference between PRS and QASP. So again, going back to writing good performance work statement and coming up with a good performance standard, that dives into that already should give you the PRS. Now, when you have the PRS and can indicate into your PWS, now that drives perfectly into the quality assurance surveillance plan. So take a look at this for a second. Let me look at Nathaniel asks, does the CSAW have a list of commonly used non-monetary incentives? So let me see where we are on the slide. I will go into incentives here a little bit. So, again, if you don't, it's not or plus fee type, cost plus fee type. It's hard to put that monetary incentives, right? So we need to enforce with non-monetary, and then oftentimes I struggled with it. Oh, past performance. Here's the C part. We'll dangle you. Here's the C part. If you do a good job, we'll put it on a good C part. Well, unfortunately, anything above a SAT, simplified acquisition threshold, you got to have a past performance in there. So some vendor, it is important for them, right? The past performance is well looked at. It is important for them. But if that is a tool that used over and over and over, it is really increase that performance incentives, right? So what I normally recommend, again, going back to the frequencies of surveillance and method of surveillance, let's say you are doing bi-weekly meeting, whether there was part of a contract or not, and then you are doing inspection, weekly inspection. Let's say this vendor is phenomenal. They understand performance standard, they understand what you're looking for. So every time you're doing inspection, they pass flying color. Okay, here's the incentive. You can reduce the surveillance. You can reduce the frequency. So if they're passing it, you're in option year 3, they never failed you. Why are you keep doing surveillance every week or every day, right? Now that becomes incentives that you can reduce our own government's cost and dime as well as vendor. Because if vendor is aware that your standard, the performance that they're measuring is weekly, they're spending additional manpower to make sure they're doing it, right? So that can be non-monetary incentive, less frequency or less report they need to provide. So that becomes non-monetary. That's why I do not include the frequency and method of surveillance, because that's our tool. So that is a part of a non-monetary incentive other than the CPARs and tying into what you're measuring on the CPARs. So and it can be varied depending on your requirement. There's a little more tools, especially if you're in IT service category, because of the requirement often will have, MVP or some of the frequent meetings in the thing then in that nature. So anytime when you have less meeting, that's a reduced cost. So essentially that becomes non-monetary, becoming monetary, but you can use those tools as incentives that can be used. But again, this is something that I've been approaching everyone as well. Keep building your library. Hey, as an acquisition professional, you're going to have multiple requirements as you progress, whether it's IT, whether it's O&M, whether it's just supplies. Whatever incentive that work for you, start building that library, starting having those tools you can utilize as you progress in your career. All right, let me talk about inspection type here a little bit. So these are commonly used one. There's 100% inspection, periodic inspection, random sampling, trend analysis, customer feedback, and third-party survey. Third-party survey, I haven't seen as much unless it's a big visibility one, because that costs another more to the government. One thing I want to inform you is the 100% inspection, especially. If you're letting them know that you're going to do 100% inspection, that means you have to do 100% inspection. Yes, you're going to hold the vendor, the contractor, responsible, and they have to make sure it is 100% inspection. But you need to really pick the inspection type that makes sense for you, especially if they're providing commodity or supplies. Maybe the random sampling will make sense, or periodics may make sense. Every 1,000, every 100 deliverable, would you take a look instead of 100% inspection, right? So knowing this and really understanding your requirement will tie nicely how you're going to review the method and frequency of your inspection time. Here's some negativity that comes with the inspection type. But again, I want to, a lot of times people commit to 100% inspection without realizing that government have to do 100% inspection, and you need to document that. If they're failing the performance and then this, well, you say you're 100% inspection, you need to able to document, yeah, out of 100, 1,000 inspection I've done, you failed 2, you failed 3, instead of just doing random sampling. So be very cautious about when you are committing 100% inspection. All right. Emily, I'm not sure. You said you saw one, wondering if there is an editable one. If you can provide a little information on that, we'll try to help you with that. Um, So here is the fundamental of CrossUp. Again, I cannot stress enough, the document is a standalone. It's your tool, it's your ammunition, it's going to enforce, it's going to be your whip. Do not include that on the contract. Anytime you do a mod, CrossUp need to be updated. That's just more admin work, that's cost to the taxpayer. But the document serves as an outline to the contractors how we plan to monitor and record the performance according to all the standard outlined in PRS, in PWS that we provide to them. It is contractor responsibility to provide a service to outline standard, not government, meaning that PRS, again, PRS, that performance requirement standard is on the contract. It's telling the vendor, this is what you need to do. They sign it, it's awarded, they are bound to perform and provide to that standard, not us. So QASP is government's document, but it does mean that we are tied to the quality standard, but assessing it and monitoring it. At minimum, the QASP should have a purpose, roles and responsibility, because not oftentimes, if it's big contract, Core is doing all the work. It might be SME, it might be, for example, I done O&M contract for that DECA commissary. It was about 200 commissaries. We had a field engineer who were recently assigned, and they were the core. But at the down level, it was a supply tech. You know, they're at that time they're making maybe $15, $16 an hour or whatever, and they had to do the quality surveillance as well. So it need to be clearly laid out who's going to surveil and how they are going to surveil. Part of the QASP, the importance of QASP is that again, staff changes, right? And because it's a performance-based acquisition, we are looking at the outcome and end result. You need to be able to duplicate it. It doesn't need to be Jack. It doesn't need to be Jill who's performing it. If the vendor comes in, they have a clear understanding of the standard quality and they can drive to that result. As a government, we should be able to identify that easily, whether I just took over the contract and performing the quality surveillance or the supply tag or even bagger at the grocery store. They should be able to look at to process and understand, oh yeah, look at this. Okay. It really need to be able to reproduce the outcome because that's the essential core of performance-based acquisition. The end result, the outcome. And when the cost should also clearly indicate the incentive portion, disincentive, but also remedy. If there is a failure, you notice what is standard operating procedure? Who do you need to report to? Do you need to tell vendor and then to expect to fix in 3-4 days? So having this minimum information is crucial on the quality surveillance document. The QASP provides an established method of measuring. Again, we own it. And I like to say this, be specific and be measurable. And we're not setting the vendor up for failure, nor we are setting ourselves up for failure by doing 100% inspection on 10,000 quantity equipment. Achievable and relevant, relevant. You need to be tied back to what you're trying to measure. It gotta make sense. It just really gotta make sense. And also time bound, but use that quality along with the time bound and tied to negative and positive incentive. You know, if there is no incentive, then that's fine. Tie it back to CPAR. If it makes sense for you to reduce meeting time or frequency of a meeting, do that. That becomes an incentive. And the government or contractor may develop the process, just like when the performance-based acquisition, we need to have a PWS. Sometimes we provide some objective and the vendor comes back with the PWS. Just like that, we can ask the vendor to come up with, hey, this is a standard. This is what we think it's going to fail and acceptable. Come up with the QCP or come up with the quality surveillance plan. Because the QCP, when they come back, they may say, instead of a person inspecting all the time, now we have a new AI that can review the documents, or the camera got developed well enough that can infrared view and then find default or faulty equipment or something like that, because now that becomes their quality control plan and they can tie it to quality assurance saying that, yeah, okay, with this new technology. So you can ask the vendor to come up and develop with the process. Lastly, you may, if it makes sense to you, again, if it makes sense to you, and especially in professional services, stay away from personal services, but if it is requiring particular set of skills, Uh, if it's weapon development, in that nature, it is okay. It makes sense to actually share your quality assurance plan because that has a clear understanding and indication of how you're going to measure it, especially if it's involved our workforce, our military, it really is crucial for them to understand how we are going to measure it and how often we are going to measure it. If there's good synergies to it, if it makes sense, again, to share that concept with the provider to the contractor so they understand how you're going to measure it and how often you're going to measure it. Again, earlier example on PRS, it showed how we are going to calculate what the 90% means on the annual basis, right? Sometimes if you omit that, it doesn't make sense because it can create a lot of vacuum. So it is really understanding the requirement and how you're going to measure. It makes sense to share it, then go ahead and share it. All right, let me look at some questions here. All right, so Andrea, we need a more example geared toward advisory assistant service. There are only so many CRASMO in contract, but we spend billions across government in advisory and assistance. Yes, I mean, unfortunately, the example I shared here are easy ones. Part of the reason being is because it gets you that understanding. The challenge with your question, advisory and assistance services, what are you advisory? What assistance are you talking? Because again, depending on what your acquisition is, some may work for emulation services versus advisory committee professional services, right? I mean, that category comes into professional service, advisory and assistant, but this is war game. We're talking about war games. We're talking about just committee advisory. You cannot really combine because that becomes you're looking at very big objective, one fits it all. So if you like to share a little more details on your requirement itself, reach out back to us at CSA@gsa.gov. We'll be happy to assist you with that. All right. How does evidence work with the CPAR process? Do the result of the cost of surveillance need to be provided as a part of evidence for CPAR rating? One of the good practice of a CPAR is when you're providing anything, well, I will correct myself there. When you're providing CPAR, before you submit into CPAR, the system contractor performance rating system, share that information with the vendor, meaning that before you actually submit into CPAR and then route it and try to meet that all the time, because let's say you submitted, they did great, so you gave them satisfactory, and then they object to it. Now it kicks back to you in the system. Now you need to re-enter all the information why you gave them satisfactory. So I personally like to share the CPAR rating once I write it up. Hey, you got excellent on this because you got awarded, you got the court stated XYZ, or you got unsatisfactory because PWS 1.2 said you need to deliver within 7 days, but you consistently failed to meet that 7 days timeline. So it really helps them to understand why you're giving that, and you need to write all that up. This is why it's important. I have a little portion here on quality surveillance and monitoring form because now we had performance-based acquisition, performance standard, coming up with well-written performance work statement, tying to your PRS, tying to your QASP. Okay, you have a good QASP, but how you're monitoring? What are you checking? How are you documenting? So I have a little slide here that's going to dive into, here's the FAR section. I'm not going to go dive into because it's for people who like to look up the FAR. Here's the information. You need to have, if you have a good QASP, now you need to be able to execute that, right? So that you need to document. Every time you see failure, you see success, document it on the either monitoring form that I'll share as an example. So that way, when you're writing up the CPAR incentivize, you have something you can go back. And again, when your core changes, when somebody who's surveilling the QASP leaves, they document all that. Somebody should be able to pick that up and carry on. Again, be able to reproduce the end result and outcome. So quickly, here is the requirement roadmap worksheet. We will be sharing this information with you with my lovely tech team once this webinar is over, we'll be sharing this information with you. So here is the quality assurance monitoring form. This is a sample. This is just the example I used. So again, when you look at this, it really dives again from the quality surveillance plan, because you had what you're measuring, where the PWS section it is, what the standard is, what the acceptable level is, and now you have a method of surveillance and frequency in here. Now here you go, 3 section. Date of monitoring, when you monitor it, right? Whether you're doing frequency, 100% inspection, random sampling or survey, you have a date in here. Now, whether contractor made AQL, if your AQL stayed at 90%, your calculation information comes, no, they exceeded or they didn't, you have information in there. When, how, what, fitting all that. And supporting narrative, so that core who somebody's surveilling, hey, I walked into the cooler today. I saw all these refrigerant spilled all over the floor by the EPA regulation. They are supposed to clean that up. The information is right there. So having this monitoring form and continues being documented by a core, and again, this should be part of a core's due diligence, and will assist you with the C parts. What type of incentives can be tied up with the firm fixed price? Can money or negative money included? Again, if you have a budgetary support, it is really difficult with the firm fixed price, because unless you're setting aside a cost or a fee to be able to pay it as monetary value, you can really use just the CPARS, past performance rating, which will allow the vendor to successfully bid on future contracts, or, as I stated before, the frequencies of your monitoring, reporting duties, and all that. So I will caution you there. Are the QASP templates available for O&M and janitorial contracts? I do have a few examples I can share, but again, this particular one, I don't have a form. I will strongly recommend taking screen capture of this particular one. And Craig, if you don't mind, send us an email at csai@gsa.gov. I can definitely provide some of the past O&M contracts classes that we have used, from simple to very complicated, looking at building automation system to just cleaning toilets. So we can definitely share that. Nathaniel, thanks for the comment. QASP must be shared with a contractor? No, Nassar, QASP, as I stated previous slide, you can share it if it makes sense. Especially when it's complex R&D, it makes sense to them to understand how often you're going to measure it. But if you share the QASP, and let's say a supply contract, they need to supply laptops, and let's say they need to supply 1,000 laptops every month, and it becomes that apparent they're failing their quality control and meeting up the AQL. Well, let's say you share the QASP, so they know, oh, they said that they will do only first of the month, so we'll do a great job on first of month and start failing all the other days, right? So that it doesn't make sense to share with them, because then they will know when you're going to measure it, who's going to measure it, right? So you don't want to share that if it doesn't make sense. And again, it is very hard to understand. Well, you just kind of sound like everything is on depends. Well, unfortunately, that's some trick that I learned as a CS. Acquisition is really depending on your requirement and your specific authority, the statutes or policies you're working under. So it is really hard to fit one fits all concept. So I will strongly caution you, but you can. It's not that don't share it or share it. You can share it if it makes sense. All right, so there was the PRS and the quality assurance monitoring form. And here is just some question that I will throw it out there for you guys, just thinking about. And again, I know I'm picking each one, but just to get you guys brain juices going to understand what the quality surveillance should be about. So here, example is roadside, when you're selling apples, you have to purchase apples from local farmer to sell to your patrol. The farmer delivers apple twice a week, Monday through Thursday. So here's type of inspection. I told you, you need to understand your requirement. You need to have your scores involved, coming up with that frequency. What is the AQL? Really writing good performance work statement. So kind of look at it. And the question is, which one is the most practical surveillance method? You don't have to answer it, but maybe it's a random sampling, or maybe, I mean, obviously 100% inspection, as I said, that's a huge commitment, not just from the vendor, but from a government as well. So 100% inspection does make sense. really could be periodic. It could be customer feedback. It could be surveys. I already said that there. I guess you can also the trend analysis, whether it's green apple versus red apple. So on this example alone, you can dive deeper based on your requirement. I already said, is it green apple? Is it red apple? Is it Gala? Is it honeydew? Is it Fuji? I mean, depending on your requirement, depending on that apple, how you like them apples, right? You need to really dive deep into what you're measuring it and how you're going to measure it. And so there is a question, if we have a site budget for firm fixed price incentive clean, can we use for firm fixed price incentives? Well, if you do have a budget and if it's cost, so let me look this one thing up here, because FAR 16.301 prohibits cost of reimbursements contract and performance-based. It is a very narrow margin that you get to use. I would like to have this sidebar conversation. Sorry, if you can send me a little more information on your requirement and what kind of acquisition strategy you have. I will just give a just general answer is that if you have a set budget that you can use as incentive, yeah, by all means, create an incentive portion and how you can, if you have specially clean, yeah. But based on firm fixed performance, you need to have a clear standard, right? Even firm fixed price contract and clean, what is acceptable level and how are you going to indicate if it's not cost plus or work cost over fee, how are you going to indicate what the performance equals what dollar value? Right? Let's say you have a $10,000 set aside. And hypothetically speaking, again, I really want to stay away from cost reimbursement because those, the commercially available product, you're not supposed to use the commercial products, contract, commercial supplies and services. So there is a very narrow margin and we can dive in what if cases. So I like to have a little more information. But if you have a fund set aside for it, yeah, by all means, if it allows it within your own authority, yeah, go for it. So hope that answers your question. So here's another example of a developing QASP. It's a little more harder one here. You are responsible for IT help desk. The performance measure first call resolution in 2 minutes. AQL is resolve each IT ticket in 2 minutes, 95% of the time. So here is just some method that you can use. What makes sense? What makes more practical? And again, you may done some IT contracts. You may not done IT contracts. So one of these methods make more sense to you. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Again, I don't know, depending on the requirement. So this is why it's really important to involve your IPT, have a clear understanding of requirement, and write better performance work statement. Because once you do that, your performance standard becomes very clear. You can tie that into PRS. Now you're already 1/3 way there. Now having that PRS on the contract allows the vendor to come up with a better QCP, and that will drive into your better quality surveillance plan. Voila, your work is done. Again, we will share the roadmap to the requirement. That particular document we do have set aside, so we'll email you. Unfortunately, the other documents, it's a kind of half developed. So if you reach out at CSAW@gsa.gov, we'll be happy to provide those information. Lastly, I have about 10 minutes here. As this webinar is provided by CSAW, I'd like to just chime in a little ad sale here. CSAW is a civilian service acquisition workshop. It was an initiative years ago. We've been very successful supporting NASA, supporting USPTO, USDA. We've been doing this for about 4 years, roughly about $6 billion total contract value. It is a facilitated workshop per your requirement involving multifunctional integrated procurement team. We had a CO, CS, a PMO office, legal sitting there, your sponsors sitting there, and really dives deep into your requirement to successfully develop a mission, measurable objective, going with the performance requirements, the standard on performance-based strategy that meets success of your requirement. Our objective is understand, apply performance-based acquisition, utilize tools, resources, all the things we shared going over with you, collaborate as a team, get the buy-in, get the support, understand what each performance work statement is and how each team member can support that. Not just from budget, not just from acquisition team, not just from PMO, but from everybody being able to support and develop a high-level roadmap. Again, using the roadmap for the requirement and successful plan, gain consensus, the critical decision path forward for your success. And we cover all these 8 steps of performance-based service acquisition, forming the team, identifying objective. We do the market research with you. We do source selection review with you. We talk about innovations. We talk about developing good work statement, defining measures, how you're going to measure it. And this is a free service from GSA, and all the participants gains 40 CLPs for attending the workshop. So if you want more information how we can help you, please reach out at CSAW@gsa.gov. And those people, I didn't answer all your questions, please feel free to reach out to me and we will support you with some templates, informations, and any future endeavors you may need. Last question. Okay, well, that is all for me. I'll pass to you, Kyle. Thank you so much for all your time.
All right. Thank you so much, Eugene. I think that wraps up all of the questions. So it looks like we answered all of the ones that were in the Q&A pod. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend part of your day with us today. We hope that you enjoyed today's webinar. If you did, we welcome you to join us in our next one, which is coming up on June 26th. That CSAW webinar will cover incentive strategies. We don't have a registration link for that just yet, but you can monitor that at our webpage, which is gsa.gov/CSAW. Have a great rest of your day.